Yeah. So let's get started. Let's get started. Welcome everybody um, to the latest in our journalism speaker series, organized by Professor Will Yerman. I am not Will Yerman. I am Patrick Plaisance. I'm the Davis professor in ethics here at the college, and I get the great opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight, and also maybe just have a little conversation with him. I hope everybody enjoys this, and I know I expect to. So Ken, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us and being part of this. We're all very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I've already apologized to Patrick, but everyone, you're likely to hear my dog tonight. He participates in every phone call and every Zoom meeting. So I'll apologize ahead of time.
Well, that won't bother us at all, I'm sure. So anyway, well, just to get us started, Ken and I are gonna chat a little bit about some things that he wants to talk about, and after a while we will open it up for questions. And so I know students will have a lot of questions, maybe even some faculty members I see in the audience. We'll have some questions for you, Ken. So I hope we have a chance for some good back and forth Q&A. And I, in particular, am expecting my students to have some good questions as well. So there you go. Ken, let me just introduce you real quick. You have been in the business for, gosh, how many decades now?
Too many. Too many. Going back to the whatever from the 80s.
Yes. And been literally all over the country at different news organizations, different types of news organizations. And now he is with ProPublica. He has done almost every kind of story under the sun. And he's most notably, he has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for so much of his work. Not once, not twice, not three times, but four times for his work. Most recently in 2016 for an investigative series that he and a colleague did, looking into the failures of law enforcement to properly investigate rape cases. And that many people might know was turned into a Netflix series or a Netflix drama, right, on called Unbelievable. So those of you who have not seen that might want to check that out. You've been on This American Life, the radio show, talking about that case. You've been around in different speaking engagements, talking about your work and journalism in general. And I have had the good fortune to call you a good colleague and friend. We worked together for how many years, Ken? 6, 8 years back in the 90s.
Actually, I think it was 2 or 3.
Right.
I was there from 92 to 94.
Yeah.
I think you got there before I did.
I did. Yeah, that's right. So we were there together at the Daily Press in Southeast Virginia, on the staff there back in the 90s. So it's been nice to keep in touch. So Ken, your talk today, when Will asked you what you wanted to talk about, you suggested you wanted to talk about the lies that you've learned from your profession.
Yes.
And we chatted about this a little earlier. And there's any number of important lessons that you've learned over the decades, over the years, or things you've had to relearn, as you said, that maybe things that perhaps were true back in the 80s and 90s, but in today's journalism environment, not so much. So yeah, tell us what do you think about that? Where do you want to start off with?
Well, I should start out by saying that the lies my profession taught me, I did not learn in journalism school. I did not study journalism in college. Instead, these were lines of conventional wisdom that I picked up at various papers when I was younger. And journalism, as you know, is one of those fields where conventional wisdom gets passed down from generation to generation, and we're expected to embrace it wholeheartedly and learn from our elders and accept their wisdom as the gospel. And what I've learned, I'm sure many generations of journalists before me learned as well, which is that a lot of that conventional wisdom is wrong or misguided. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about that. And I thought maybe by talking about one story in particular, I could show how some of the things that I learned when I was young didn't really apply as I got older. So I thought I would talk about the story that became unbelievable. This was a story that I worked on when I was at the Marshall Project, which was a startup at the time. It's a nonprofit newsroom that covers the criminal justice system. And in 2015, I was working on a story about a young woman in Washington State who had been victimized twice. She had been sexually assaulted, and then she had been accused of lying about being attacked, and was even charged criminally while being accused of filing a false report. That was the story that became the Netflix series Unbelievable. It became a This American Life episode. It became a book, and it was also an online story that we published at the Marshall Project. One of the first ways in which that story and its evolution contradicted what I had learned when I was young was the ways in which a partnership developed as the reporting was going on. Patrick, as you know, when we were starting out, the mantra in every newsroom was to compete. If we didn't have a newspaper we were competing with, we created some kind of news source to create. We were competing with the local news on television or on radio, the alternative weekly, whatever it was. And it was just accepted as a given that competition made us better, made us work harder, it drove us, and it elevated our work. And that may be true in certain contexts, but I think the opposite is more true, at least in today's media landscape. While I was working on this story, I got an email from my editor. My editor was Bill Keller, who's a former executive editor of the New York Times. Bill sends me an email, and the subject line is, "Oh, crap." Only the word wasn't crap, it was the other word. And that's not the subject line you want when you get an email from your editor. But what Bill had learned was that while I was working on this story for the Marshall Project, ProPublica was working on the same story, and another reporter there named T. Miller was working on it. We were working on it from separate ends, which is why we hadn't tripped across each other earlier. I was working on the part of the story that took place in Washington. T was working on the part of the story that took place in Colorado. When we were discovered, and it was T that discovered it, that we were working on it together, years ago, what would have happened is that ProPublica, knowing that it had competition, would have rushed its story into print. It would have done whatever it took to finish the story as quickly as possible, to get it in first, and to undermine the competition. That's not what happened here. Instead, ProPublica reached out to us and asked if we wanted to partner. So instead of competing, we collaborated. And it was actually a three-way partnership because I was already working with This American Life, the radio show, as well. So it became a three-way partnership where ProPublica and the Marshall Project did a print story. And then we pivoted and did a 1-hour episode of This American Life. The story was benefited in ways that I look back on in so many ways from us going this direction. It was actually pretty serendipitous because I had half the story and T had half the story. I had the story about Marie, the young woman in Washington, who had not been believed, even as she had been telling the truth all along. And so I had a story about a police department that did everything wrong. And so it was just about an investigation that went off the rails and about the people in Marie's life who didn't believe her for reasons that sadly are common. And that there were real lessons to be learned from what she had gone through. T had the story in Colorado of an investigation done right, and about detectives there who had worked together brilliantly to track down a serial killer and solve a series of crimes that were happening in Denver's suburbs. When I look back on it again, this is something where everybody who was involved in the decision to partner, we had all come up in the opposite culture. The editors at ProPublica and the Marshall Project were almost exclusively from the New York Times, where they're competing with the Post, the Daily News, Newsday, Wall Street Journal. It's compete, compete, compete. And the two editors, Bill Keller and Joe Sexton at ProPublica, knew each other. They wanted to beat each other. And it was T. Miller, the other reporter, who talked his editor off the ledge and convinced him to try this. And then Bill reached out to me, and he thought that I would resist this at every turn too, because I had worked at the Chicago Tribune, which was a very competitive environment. T. Miller had worked at the LA Times, which was a very competitive environment. In every instance, all of the people who were the principal collaborators in this were people where we had to adapt and learn to change that model. And in journalism now, this is really, I think, one of the biggest shifts that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, is that our first impulse now is not necessarily to compete, or at least it's not our exclusive impulse. It's to collaborate. At ProPublica, we partner on most of our stories. So we have a story and we try to think, what is the best medium for this? Is it radio? Is it magazine? Is it newspaper? Is it television? And then we reach out to somebody who we'd like to work with, who we've had a good relationship in the past with, or whose work we admire, and we partner up. And we each take our strengths and merge them. And what we care about is getting the story right, not about getting it first or getting it alone. And this way is better. I am a full-on convert to the idea of, when we reach out and we look around and we find partners, that's a better way to do the story. And the story and its audience are really the key beneficiaries. Other ways in which this story differed from what I learned when I was younger. When T and I wrote the story, it's a 2 byline story. We each wrote half. That's very unusual. The usual model, in years gone by, was that if you saw a story with 2 bylines, one of those reporters wrote it, and the other might have done more reporting.
One was a
But
lead.
that's right. There was this sense, and this is kind of faded over the years. But in the 80s and 90s, there was this push to get journalists to specialize and to fit defined roles. When I was at the Chicago Tribune, editors wanted to define you as either a reporter or a writer. And they would often then, on stories, take one person who was considered a strong reporter and combine him or her with somebody who was considered a strong writer. And I hated that. I resisted that at every step of the way, because initially they wanted to define me as a reporter. I didn't want to be defined as a reporter. And then they actually tried to define me as a writer. And I didn't want to be defined as a writer, because I think we do our best work when we try to gather as many skills as we can. And usually when you're writing a story, if you've done the reporting, it shows, right? You have greater command of the material. You've talked with the people who are at the heart of the story. You've been to the places that you're describing.
You can write with authority, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that really, back in the day when Newsweek was a real force as a magazine, you would see those stories, right? Where it would be a long story and you would have a contribution box at the bottom of it. And it would list 6 people who reported it and 1 person who wrote it. And it's a person who's writing it based upon all the notes that have been fed to him or her.
Mhm.
And it had the feel, you could tell the distance between the writer and the material. At least I think I could. And I've often thought that in reporting, there was that sense before that you would also not only have a divide between reporters and writers, there would be people who were data reporters, right? And if you were a data reporter, that's what you did. Now you find people who do data, who write, who report, who are brilliant interviewers, who have great command of other ways to tell stories. And I think that the more that you can do to pick up all of those skills and bring that to the table, the better off you are. And the reason you often also don't have two writers is because there's this sense that there's going to be a jarring voice, that you're going to have two voices competing with one another. We didn't worry about that in this case. We each wrote the way we like to write, and then we did a braided narrative where T's version was on the right side when he's writing about Colorado. Mine's on the left side. We designed it in different channels, and we actually allowed our different voices to be kind of in juxtaposition, and it was a way that we just didn't worry about that. We had no nut graph in the story. This was a 12,000 word story. There's no nut graph. You won't find a paragraph in there that tells the reader what to think. You know, dear reader, this is what this story is about. This is why it's important. This is why you should care. This is the takeaway. Before, it was, again, conventional wisdom. Every story had to have a nut graph. And if it didn't, that's the first thing the editor would bring to you. You know, it's like, oh, I like the lead, I like the body, but where's the nut graph? Let's work on that. And I think what we've learned is that, you know, if you write a story without a nut graph, it's an exercise in trust. You trust the writers, you trust the editors, you trust the reader. The best stories, if it's a narrative, and so this isn't something that applies to all kinds of stories, but if you're writing a narrative, you're writing a story instead of an expose, ideally the reader can write the nut graph at story's end for themselves. They get the takeaway because they've experienced it, they've gone through it, and they understand simply by virtue of having read the story what the nut graph is. When we wrote this story, we published it in 2015, and it was about events that had occurred principally in 2008. So one of the first checkbox items that I learned, you know, in newsrooms gone by, people always wanted to know how old the story was, right? And if it had happened a week ago, well, it was too old. If it had happened a year ago, why are you even talking to me, right? So the idea of writing about something that happened 7 years ago, that flies in the face of a lot of the conventional wisdom. But what I found is that some stories are as applicable today as they were when they happened, even if it was 5, 10, 15 years ago, because the system failures that occurred endure. They're still there. You know, it might be a morality tale that still applies, or it might be about institutional failures that still apply. And a lot of times that passage of time works in our favor instead of against us. Marie talked to me. Marie was the young woman in Washington State who is at the heart of this story. And she had never talked to the media before. And when I approached her through an intermediary, it had been 7 years, and she had had time to collect, to reflect, to more time to deal with the trauma, you know, that she had suffered. And I think a lot of times as reporters, we're too impatient. You know, we go to people in the immediate aftermath of an event in which they've been hurt or in which they've caused hurt. And a lot of times people aren't ready to talk to us in either of those instances. And what I'll do is I'll create a file, and it's actually a manila folder. It's my call later file. And I'll take stories like that where I think somebody might be ready to talk 6 months from now or a few years from now, and I'll check in with them then. By then, other reporters will have gone on. They will have left the area. They'll have forgotten about the story because that's what we do. And I figure, okay, then I'll check in and see if they might be willing to share their stories and their experiences now. And that's something, it doesn't always pay off, but all it costs you is the time of cutting out a story in the days when we used to do that out of the newspaper, putting it in a manila folder and putting a reminder in your calendar to call in 6 months. And all you're doing then is making a phone call or writing an email. The cost in terms of time spent is so minimal, but the rewards are potentially so great. And the one other thing from the story, and then I'll stop blabbing so we can start discussing more. But I really appreciated that we were able to work across platforms with this story. That was something that when I was younger, it wasn't that we were taught not to work across platforms. It's just that the opportunity wasn't there very often. And in this instance, when you are reporting on a story and you get to write it as a narrative online, and then you get to participate in telling the same story on the radio, with the people at This American Life, and then you get to write a book about it, and then you see an 8-part dramatized series where it's a based on, dramatization. You really come to appreciate the strengths of these other different platforms. You're reaching different audiences, and as a reporter, you're learning from other places. I learned so much from working with This American Life, and it's made me change a lot of the things that I do as a print reporter, because there are some things that radio does that we don't, and their way is better. So I've incorporated that into my interviewing, and in some ways, at times, into my writing.
Like what?
But
What?
with interviews on radio, you're not asking for information, you're asking for stories.
It's a conversation more, right? Yeah.
That's right. You're asking people, tell me about what happened next. Tell me about what happened when the truck drove up. You're asking people to narrate scenes and to reconstruct events. And when they do that, the details just come naturally. And a lot of the information that they give you is better in terms of the quotes and in terms of how it becomes, as you're saying, a conversation as opposed to an interview. And a conversation really lends itself to story more than an interview does. It's the difference between saying, okay, the truck was white, right? And they say yes, as opposed to you asking, tell me about the truck. And then they tell you, well, I had never seen a truck like this. The rear view mirror was bent. It had this distinctive scratch on the left front panel. There was rust over here. They offer up details and why they remember it in a particular way. And as a print reporter, particularly one who's focused a lot on investigative reporting, you're trying to nail down bits of information. And a lot of the interviews I was doing were kind of fill in the blank questions. All right, I'm just like, can you confirm for me this? Can you confirm for me that? And with radio, you don't do that. And the other thing with radio is they believe in the value of silence. When you ask a question and it's answered, you sit and you wait afterwards, and you let that silence sit. And a lot of times people will fill it. And they've had more time to think about it. Their answers are better.
Yep. That's always been one of my secret weapons, right? To use the power of silence and to try to teach that. And every time I teach reporting, that's so powerful. And a lot of students don't realize that, right? They feel like this urge to, I need to fill it. I need to keep it going.
It's difficult. And, for me, it was even worse than not letting a silence linger. Particularly when I was younger, I still do it, but I've gotten better. I interrupted people all the time. Terrible habit. And I also would show off. I would feel the need to let the person I'm interviewing know how much I know. I don't know if that's out of insecurity or what it is. But I remember I listened to one interview that I did at the Chicago Tribune. It was a 4-hour interview of a prosecutor. And I was so proud of it because it was a difficult interview to get. And he talked to me for 4 hours, and I go back to the newsroom. I'm thinking, that went great. And then I transcribed it. And in those 4 hours, the voice I heard the most was my own. I was interrupting him. I was stepping on his quotes. I was talking about how I knew this already, I knew that already. It was awful, and as I was transcribing the interview, I was embarrassed. My face was turning red, and my voice inside my head is telling myself to shut up. It was just like, just shut up, just shut up. Let him speak. This is the point of the interview. Let him speak.
Mm.
And that was really something that I carried with me for a long time afterwards, is that I had that voice inside my head telling me to shut up. But in radio, the producer I was working with before every interview, she saw that I still had some of these habits. So she would tell me, don't interrupt. And she would tell me, when he's done talking, don't say anything. Count to 5, right? And they were just great reminders, and it was brilliant. And the other thing about radio is they write communally.
Mm.
Um, Robin, the producer, and I, we wrote a script, but then we took it into New York, and then they would have 6 to 8 producers around a table, and you would have the script up in a shared file, and everybody's got it on their screen, and it's all in edit mode, and everybody's writing in and out of it, and it's scary when
What
you're
a
not used to
nightmare.
that. Yep. It's something that apparently a lot of print reporters run out of that room. It's what Ira Glass was saying afterwards. A lot of people just flee in terror. And after a week, I found that I understood the benefits of it, because it's kind of like the equivalent of a jury room, where you're drawing on people's collective experiences and backgrounds. And that's not something that we usually associate with writing. We think of it as an individual or even a lonely pursuit. And at least at This American Life, they go the opposite direction. And there are some real advantages to it.
Great, great. What else? What else? You don't have much of a presence on social media, and that's, I'm sure that's deliberate.
It is. I think social media is something where everybody finds their own comfort level. And for me, I don't think it's a generational thing so much as it is that I'm not comfortable online sharing opinions, having a big personality, being bold. It's not who I am. I'm I'm a boring person in person. I'm a boring person online. I don't feel the need to try to create a personality that isn't there or that isn't natural. And I'm not sure that that's right, because I see some people who use social media, some reporters who use it brilliantly, and it makes their work better. They're able to create sources and bring in information in a way that really elevates their work. And other people enjoy sparring online, right? They enjoy the give and take. I don't. I am someone, I don't like to engage with people, and I don't like to argue. I don't like it. The whole thing gives me the willies, and it's called social media. And as you know, I've never been particularly social. I get very uncomfortable in crowds, and there's really no bigger crowd than Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, so those places. And so for me, I don't have much of a presence. It's largely by choice. I don't know that it's the right decision, but it's the right decision for me.
Yeah, yeah. I asked that because, I mean, you're talking about conventional wisdom, right? That for you has proven to be questionable at best, and I might suggest that conventional wisdom now, right, with this generation, is that you do cultivate a presence if you're in the media, and that's almost that's largely considered a duty, a journalistic duty, right? To cultivate that engagement that you say you don't want.
Yeah.
So there's a certainly a shift there, I think.
And I think if it's something that comes to you naturally, or that you just have a feel for, Absolutely. I see real advantages to it,
Yeah.
you know. But you'll see some writers at the New Yorker who have no online presence whatsoever, and they consistently do some of the best work in the country, right? Jane Mayer has very little online presence. You know, if there's a better reporter in the United States right now, I don't know who it is. And a lot of the New Yorker writers are like that. But then again, you look at somebody like David Fahrenthold, right, at the Washington Post. He has so effectively used
Yeah.
social media to it. And he does it without being a contrarian, without being argumentative. He uses it because he shares information in a way that's really powerful. And he invites readers in to participate in his reporting, right? He shows them his notes, his working lists, what he's doing. It's really pretty brilliant.
Yeah.
And it shows in his work, because his work is just phenomenal.
Yep, yep. So in social media, as a journalist, know thyself, right? I mean, you have to kind of know what type you are and how and what your mission is in its use, and just really be smart about it, right?
I think so. And where it gets tricky is that the lines are constantly being erased and redrawn in various newsrooms. And some of the journalists who I feel really badly for are ones who get caught in the transition, where they think that the rules are this, and then an editor informs them that no, really, the lines are over here.
Yeah.
And it's tricky. And that's what makes it a little bit dangerous in-house, in terms of you may post something that you think is fully in keeping with what's allowed in your newsroom, only to have it blow up and go sideways online, and then have an editor come in and chastise you or worse for something when your colleagues are doing the same or doing something even arguably more beyond the line.
Right.
And that happens quite a bit. So
Yes.
there are real risks associated with that.
And we're still figuring that out, right? I mean, there's the norms are still evolving, I think. We have different news organizations that have fairly clear social media policies, but others do not, and others are still kind of groping their way, right? So that makes it hard for individual journalists who are told in here at Penn State and other programs the importance of cultivating your brand online, right? Well, to do that, we need to be very clear on some guidelines, right? On some norms, and those seem to be changing.
They are, and they're distinctly different in different news organizations. Like if you are working at Reuters, Reuters has an expectation that you are going to be, if not invisible online, you are going to be really boring and flat, and you're just not going to make any waves there. They don't want people to be taking positions
Yeah.
online. They certainly don't want them being partisan online. Whereas in other newsrooms, they're perfectly fine with people generating large followings by having a big personality and having strong positions. So it's not just that you have to know yourself, you really got to know your news organization.
Sure.
And even beyond their policies, you have to know who it is that's interpreting the policies, right? How is your editor reading and interpreting those policies?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the even greater risk, of course, is um, journalists who, because of their online presence, or in part because of their online presence, find themselves in a situation where they are the target of harassment, of attacks, sometimes very serious attacks, right? I mean, I know colleagues who have had security details at their house because of threats made. So that's a big concern, and I know you're familiar with those.
It's a huge concern, and again, it shouldn't be this way, but for women journalists and for journalists of color, it's much worse. You know, the insults, the threats, the volume and the nature of them, it's just appalling.
Yeah.
And you will see journalists sharing some of the threats that they get online, and it's chilling. And it goes beyond threats, right? It does go to doxing. There are physical dangers. There's types of tools that people can use to go after you
Yeah.
in a way that can really make your life miserable. And and that is another thing that I think you have to include in the calculus is are you willing to live with in that environment, because it's stressful. It's already a stressful job. When you add that component to it, it really compounds it.
Yeah. I mean, we both have a colleague at the Washington Post who was I know who was just doxxed last week, and some of the threats that she got were just amazing, ridiculous.
Yeah.
So very scary, very
Yeah.
scary. Mm-hmm. What else? What other changes do you think are notable or important for young journalists looking out toward the industry and going into it? What other significant evolutions do you see that they really need to be mindful of?
One would be um, the old idea, and this is coupled with the idealization of competition, was that you, as a reporter, you would never let anyone outside your newsroom know what you were working on until you published, right? Because if you did that, the competition might learn about it, or people who you're reporting on might learn about it before you want them to. We just saw danger around every corner by not keeping our work close to our vest until the story was in that morning's paper. It's not that way now. And at ProPublica, and there are other newsrooms that do this as well, but ProPublica, I'll do a little bit of cheerleading here, I think is probably ahead of the field on this. We have a brilliant audience engagement team. And it's a team, I think they have 6 or 7 people on it. And their job is to create sources before publication or create them afterwards to bring readers in. And what we'll do is we'll have call outs and we'll have announcements that we are working on this subject in this place right now. If you have a story to tell that relates to this, please share it with us. And we'll have a questionnaire that they can fill out. We'll have ways for them to reach us confidentially or whatever way that they wish. And we'll also have community forums where we will go to a particular place and we'll invite people to come step up at a microphone, tell their stories. We'll create panels where we'll have community forums where we talk about stories. It's a way that after I went to ProPublica, I've discovered how incredibly powerful a reporting tool this is. And I've seen so many stories that would not have been told with the same depth or emotion or authority if it wasn't for ProPublica's audience engagement team and this new way of thinking, right? You're inviting the reader to participate with you in the reporting.
Yeah.
And you're saying, I don't care if other people know I'm working on it. I'm willing to live with that.
Right.
What my goal is to do the story better, in more depth, with more time, with more sources. And that is a big change in the way that things were done even 10 years ago, I think.
Absolutely. And ProPublica was actually, I mean, they were at the as you said, the forefront of that. That was very unusual, right? To open up their channels to whoever, if they had a story idea or they had information on the story that they were doing, right? I remember seeing those very early, and obviously a real successful strategy.
It was, and the people who they've recruited to that team are brilliant, and they just get it. And I don't know that they were ever taught the opposite. You know, they're most of them are younger, and I don't think they were ever brought up in this culture of, you can't do that. What are you talking about? You're doing a questionnaire ahead of publication. And a lot of times it lets you reach people who you are going to struggle mightily to reach otherwise. I worked on a project last year, we're still working on it, about customer service agents. And a lot of them work at home. It's a really difficult industry. It's part of the gig economy for the most part. You know, the people who are answering customer calls, they take so much abuse. They get paid so little. They're denied so many employee protections and benefits. And a lot of them, just as a standard course of business, are required to sign non-disclosure agreements. So they're forbidden, you know, from documents that they sign on the front end from talking about their work. That's a difficult group to reach unless you use a call out, right? So we would do a call out, and it's not just that we post the call out online. Our engagement reporters go and buy ads, you know, in trade publications where they're most likely to reach the target audience. They take out ads on Facebook. They really have found ways to not go with a shotgun, but to find a way to really narrow their ways of trying to reach people. And it's really neat to brainstorm with them, because when you're working on a story, we'll often have a 1-hour brainstorming session with the audience engagement team, and everybody just, no idea is too crazy, right? You just throw it out there. And they have one rule with those meetings, which is nobody can be assigned work, because if that happens, nobody will attend these meetings. So the whole idea is just come out, throw out ideas, and then we'll proceed from there. But I that's another area where I'm a full-on convert. I love audience engagement. Another thing that's really different is I worked mostly in daily newspapers for the vast majority of my career. That stopped when I was 50. And when I was 50, I moved over to where I was doing a lot more magazine work and some radio work, and just trying out other different media. And that's when it really occurred to me that something I had been doing before, but often in newspapers, this isn't universal, but a lot of traditional newspaper people believe that you absolutely do not go over your stories before publication with people you're writing about. You know, they think that that's just inherently wrong.
Yeah.
Well, what do magazines do when they're fact checking? They do the very opposite of that as a normal course of business. And they do that because if something in the story is wrong, they'd much rather know about it before publication than after. So they will call people who are quoted in the story, and they'll say, the story says this about you. And they'll read it, or they'll give them the facts. It says you have 2 children, their ages are this. It says you said this, and they read the quote. They say that your home has 4 bedrooms and the walls are green, whatever. They just go through it point by point. In newspapers, it'd be like, you can't do that. And the thing is, you can do that. And
I remember being told, don't do that, but I did it anyway, right? And didn't tell my editors, but it saved my butt on, you know, on just getting things right and characterizing things properly. You know, I don't necessarily wanted to show them the whole story, but the pieces that they were relevant to, and they could help me make sure everything was right. So yeah, absolutely.
well, it's such hubris to not do that, to assume that we have it all right. And instead of going to the people who actually know firsthand, you know, and it might be a story that you're writing about a complex subject and it's experts.
Right.
By all means, I'm reaching out to them. I'm not giving them veto power. You weren't either, right? You're not saying you have control over the theory. All you're saying is if you think there's something here that's inaccurate, unfair, or that's going to cause harm in a way that I haven't thought about, let me know.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, there's got to be ground rules, right?
Yeah.
And if so, that just builds trust, that builds confidence on both sides. It's just, yeah, yeah. I'm glad that's changed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're saying you wouldn't tell editors. I found that the way I dealt with it is I wouldn't work for editors who didn't share my belief in doing that. And as time went on, that became less and less of a problem because I think the industry in general shifted to that direction. But I gave a talk at ASNE 3 years ago. So that's the Society of Newspaper Editors, right? So it's all the big newspaper editors. And I talked about how I do this. And there were editors in that audience, who were like looking at each other saying, you can't do it. And one wrote me an email afterwards, a nasty email saying, you can't do that.
Really?
And I just told him, well, you're not my editor. And I can do that. And you'll never be my editor. Because if you believe that, I'm never going to work for you. But that sentiment is still there in some reaches or some corners of different newsrooms, and it's problematic. Like when I wrote Unbelievable, I went through the story with Marie. Right, the last thing I wanted. She's been hurt in ways that are almost impossible to fathom by society, by her friends, by police. The last thing I want to do is add the media to that and compound the harm and write something that is untrue or misleading, or she's going to tell me, look, you know, I didn't know you were going to do that and you don't realize this, but here are the consequences of you reporting that. And if she points that out to me beforehand, it may be something that will not hurt the integrity of the story at all if I remove it. And I want to know beforehand so that we can make those decisions beforehand. But it's also what you said too, trust, right? You build more trust with people when they know that you don't just assume that you got everything right the first time around and that all you have to do is hit publish. Right. I think a lot of people really, and the other benefit of it, you probably found this, when you go and you fact check with people, a lot of times they tell you more.
Oh, heck yeah. Or they'll call me up days, weeks later. Hey, did you hear about this? Or hey, this would be a good story. You should look into this, right?
Yep.
All the time.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's because they've had time to sit with it too. It's like we'll call people and we'll interview them once. And if they're like me, my memory is the kind where if you ask me a question today, I'll give you an answer. But 2 days later, I could give you a better answer because I thought about it. Something's occurred to me.
Yep.
When you call them back in the fact-checking process, you've allowed that time to pass. And they say, after we talked, I remembered this. And then they'll share something more. Yep. And I've had that happen any number of times. So there are just all kinds of advantages to that approach.
Terrific. Terrific. Gosh, great, Ken. This has been terrific. We've covered a lot of ground here. Let's open it up to some questions. So those of you in the audience, if you would like, why don't you type in some questions in the Q&A? I'll use the Q&A, not the chat, and so we can look at those. And Ken, why don't we? There's already a couple, so why don't we start off? Kurt Chandler is one of our journalism professors here. So he has a good question, and I'll just read it. I don't know if you can see it, Ken. Can you?
I can.
Okay. So newsrooms have been trying to diversify unsuccessfully for decades. There's a case being made by journalists from underrepresented communities that mainstream media is produced by older white guys like us for an audience of other older white guys. White editors determine what stories should be covered and when a story is successful. Do you have any insight into the scope of both the audience and point of view problems and how they might be resolved?
This is one of the dominant issues in journalism now, and deservedly so. And I'm constantly reminded of how awful this problem is and how long-standing it is on Facebook. I don't post Facebook a lot, but a lot of times people will post pictures of newsrooms that I worked in the 1990s, sometimes the 1980s, 2000s. And it is just mortifying when I look at those and I see a sea of white faces.
Yeah.
And most of them men. I can tell you what ProPublica is doing, because I think that there are some things there that are really helpful. Though ProPublica and its editors will be the first to tell you that they've made strides, but they're not nearly where they want to be. We're not where we need to be. But it's something where ProPublica publishes an annual report, where we tell people across the board what our numbers are. How many journalists of color do we have? How many of them are in different parts of the news organization? How many are on the editorial side? How many are on the business side? How many are in managerial positions versus the lower tiers of the place? I think that's a big start. I think the more transparent we are with how far behind we are, the more likely we are to get better. And ProPublica has more women than men in the newsroom, and has, I think, for 3 years now. And our most recent report on this came out, I think, just last week. You can even find it on ProPublica's website on there now. And the percentage of journalists of color in our newsroom is pretty comparable to the national average now, but not in the managerial ranks.
Yeah.
Our managerial ranks do not have that same level of diversity. And the other thing that ProPublica does, and I participate in a lot of the, ProPublica allows people like me, just staff members, to participate in interviewing job candidates. And ProPublica has what they call, a Rooney Rule, where we will have no position filled without interviewing at least one applicant of color. And I think, I can't remember the percentages, but in the last year and a half, ProPublica is a rare newsroom that is growing, and we're growing leaps and bounds, which is, we're very lucky. And more than half of the people who have been hired in the past year have been journalists of color. And we're a better newsroom because of it. And we're also trying to help create some of the historical inequities we've had. Journalism, almost by its awful design, was built to exclude people of color from early on, right? The embrace of non-paying internships, right? What a horrible practice. The idea that you can get into the elite newsrooms if you have all these internships and your family happens to be wealthy enough to let you live in New York or Los Angeles, for a summer while you're not being paid. And it goes beyond that, but journalism has all kinds of really indefensible practices in its history that explain why we are where we are. ProPublica, we fund a lot of fellowships, we fund a lot of scholarships. We work to be able to send students at journalism schools, students of color, to IRE. We bring them in where they can work with ProPublica for 9 months, where they can meet with different staff members and develop various skills. This is the inequities that we're seeing are not going to be reversed quickly. Yeah. And it's because of those longstanding problems. But I think ProPublica is, to its credit, it's transparent about where it was before, which was not good, where we are now, which is better, and where we want to go, which is where we need to be. That's a big start. And then just trying to make it so that it's easier for people who are young to get the skills that are most valued early on. That makes a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's something that we think about a lot. And I really do. When I saw a picture of a newsroom I worked at in California in the late 80s. And I think there were probably 30 journalists in it, and everyone was white.
Yeah.
And that's not an unusual experience.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Good. Good. Next question from Isabella. She's asking about your call later folder that you talked about. When you go back to your call later folder and follow up with these people, do you read what other reporters have already published, if they have, or do you start fresh in terms of the facts of the matter, or if that makes sense?
I usually try to see what else has been written first, because I think that I'm more likely to be able to find a different approach that they maybe haven't already dealt with. What people may say that so and so declined to be interviewed because, right? And maybe there's something in that because clause that gives me something to work with. Like it might say because they signed a confidentiality agreement in a lawsuit they filed. And I may happen to know that the lawsuit they filed was against a public agency, which means that confidentiality agreement is unenforceable. You cannot have a confidentiality agreement in a lawsuit against a public agency. So that gives me something that I can work with. And so to me, information is valuable, and I do want to know what other people have reported, but I'm not going to let it dictate what I do going forward. If somebody has talked before, I will start fresh in the sense of I always try to approach people without a set of preconceived notions. And I haven't always been that way. When I was younger, I was very sure of myself. I was very sure of others, and I was very judgmental. And as I've gotten older, I've become less sure of myself. I think a little less judgmental, and quicker to forgive, and more understanding of the mistakes that we all make, and how we can learn from them.
Good. Other question from Rachel, one of my students. What is a question that you wish you were asked more often? And what would your response be?
A question that I didn't start getting until a few years ago was about stress. It used to be that, whenever I would talk to other journalists or talk to journalism students, it was always about craft. It was about interviewing, writing, public records. And more recently, I've started getting questions about people asking about stress. And I think that's an incredibly important question. It doesn't get asked often enough. And if I was a young journalist now, I would start thinking about it now. Do you have ways to deal with stress? Are you prepared for the stress that comes with this work? The sooner you can come up with strategies to deal with it, the better off you'll be. I don't know if it was because of some false notion of chest thumping testosterone or whatever it was, but it used to be you didn't talk about stress, you just kind of laughed it off. And that's not a good approach. That's not a good formula. And those of you who are going to go into journalism, you've probably already seen that it's a stressful job. It's more stressful now than it was when I was a young reporter. And I think it's only going to become more stressful. So I think that's something that's worth talking about with colleagues and with other people, and just constantly trying to get an idea of what have other people found to be helpful. Is that something that you can incorporate into your life and into your work?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Angelina asks, you've moved around a lot in a lot of states, worked different jobs, and completed a lot of projects. How do you feel about the change of pace? And is it ever difficult to manage?
For me, the change of pace was really helpful. It was something that I needed. And like I mentioned before, when I turned 50, I left newspapers. And it was because I needed to do something different. I felt like I was in a rut and I was writing the same kinds of stories in the same kinds of ways over and over again. And if I didn't learn some new things, I was just going to atrophy. And and I was lucky in the sense that when the Marshall Project started, um, the editor was Bill Keller, who had all of these relationships based upon his work at the New York Times that I didn't have. So if I wanted to do magazine work, I didn't have to contact the editor of the New Yorker, who was not going to take my call. I didn't have to call, the executive producer at This American Life, who was not going to take my call. Instead, Bill would do that, and then I would get in the room with them, and I could make my pitch. And that was something that really, I think, helped save me in a lot of ways, was getting to learn whole new ways of doing things at an age when I could have just stayed in newspapers, but I don't think I would have been happy. And when I was young, their jobs were more plentiful in journalism. So I kind of view journalism as a way of being able to see the country, right? So I moved around a lot. You get to see small towns in Idaho and Colorado, California and Alaska, Virginia. It's really a neat way to meet a lot of people who you would otherwise never meet, see a lot of places. Why else would you go to Twin Falls, Idaho? I mean, nothing against Twin Falls, Idaho. Unless you're watching Evel Knievel jump the Snake River Canyon, there's not a lot to draw you there. But that's where I met my wife. So I'm very grateful, that I went to Twin Falls, Idaho, and worked at the Times News. It's one of the things that I most appreciate about journalism is that you can have a change of pace in terms of where you work, but also just the type of work that you do, even if you stay in the same place. There's really a lot of opportunity for variety, as long as you're open to it. And it's something that you want. It's one of the best things I think about journalism.
Absolutely, I have to agree with that. Yep. Genesis asks, what is your number one advice for future journalists?
I think, well, one, I'll tell you mistakes that I made. One, I never learned a foreign language. I dabbled. I took the necessary number of credits to get my degree. I never thought seriously about becoming fluent. That was a big mistake. I should have learned how to speak Spanish. I never became adept at data analysis. I'm good at using data in stories. I'm good at finding ways to capitalize on it, but I don't have the skills to organize it and analyze it. But I have had the good fortune to work with other people who do, so I constantly partner with them. But I wish that I had opened that door earlier and that I could do a lot of that work myself. If I was a young journalist now, I would find a subject that is really intimidating to other people, that they're going to avoid at all costs, whether it's some type of high finance, some complicated form of science, something that is going to be part of our news cycle for decades to come. But you are fascinated by it. Other people are intimidated by it, but you're fascinated by it. You can't get enough of it. And you specialize in it and you create your own beat out of it. The closest thing that I had to that was I went to law school after undergraduate, and I dropped out after a year. But in that first year, I learned legal research. So I learned how to use Lexis and Westlaw in a way that other reporters don't. And a lot of the reporting that I've done in my career, I can trace back to the things I learned in my 1 year of law school. I learned the vocabulary. And there's ways to use legal research for practicing law, and there's ways to use legal research for practicing journalism, and they're different. And I've been able to go in and just draw on all of these various fields and files that you can find in these legal databases and tease stories out of them. But that's a more common skill than some of these other things I'm describing. But to me, it's like journalists who find ways to differentiate themselves from generalists while pursuing something that they are just infatuated with, they're obsessed with. They read everything they can pick up on it. If you find something like that and it relates to something that is going to be important, in the news. When Patrick and I were younger, do you remember when there were very few science writers?
Yeah.
It's hard to mention, but in the 80s and 90s, if you were an experienced science writer, you were considered a little bit of an outlier.
Or an environment writer. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And I think that there are things like that now, where there are similar things where it'll be common in every newsroom to have somebody who covers a particular subject, but it's not now. And I would try to find ways to identify that. But like, if you know high finance, if you love economics, and you can write about those with real authority, you have a huge step up. And there are any number of fields. It can be, if you want to be a foreign correspondent, I'm sure you can work on an international desk. There are all kinds of ways that you can start laying the groundwork for that now. Yeah. I was offered a job, the Moscow bureau, when I was at the Chicago Tribune. And I turned it down for a number of reasons, but one was I had no skills to do that job. I didn't speak Russian. I didn't have much in the way of international experience. I didn't have much knowledge about Russian history. I could have gone and done the job, but there were other people who could have done it much better. And I think in a way you can start laying groundwork for the job that you would love to do when you're 35. I think you can start laying that groundwork now.
Yeah, and you should. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Rachel asked a question that goes back to kind of the stress issue that you were talking about earlier. How would you suggest to people new to the industry how to deal with the emotional baggage of your job, and how do you hang it all up once you get home or have separation between your work and personal life?
I would have a different answer to that 2 years ago than I would now, because right now there is no separation, right? I'm talking to you from my home. my office is my home, and it feels like personal and professional lives have merged to such an extent that they're indistinguishable. I think that it's important to talk about it, and if you're finding that you're absorbing a lot of trauma, finding people to share that with. And you find that more commonly now, where reporters are creating informal groups where they can talk about things like that and just share what they're dealing with. A lot of journalists are in therapy and get a lot from it. And that's something that I've thought about, that, when normal times return, that might be something I'd like to take a look at. When I did that questionnaire for IRE, I think I reached out to about 36 people in journalism. This included everybody from Marty Barron at the Post to people who worked at smaller dailies, and asked them about their experiences with stress. And what really stood out to me was that everybody deals with it. And I find that to be comforting, to know that you're not alone. If you're finding that you're absorbing a lot of stress, it's important to know that you're not alone. And their ideas for dealing with it, they really ran the gamut. A lot of it was yoga. Yoga popped up a lot. Meditation, bicycling, hiking, physical exercise figured prominently. Alcohol did not. It popped up a little bit, but alcohol was the way to deal with stress of choice for many years, back before. I don't think that's the healthiest way to deal with it. But I think that there's no universal answer, that people find different ways. But particularly with a lot of younger reporters, I did an IRE panel with a reporter in Florida. Her name was Lulu Ramadan. And I think when we did the panel, she was either 23 or 24 years old. And she had already covered 3 mass shootings at that young age. I think she had covered the Pulse nightclub shootings. I think she covered Parkland. And there was another. And imagine being a journalist where you're going from one horrific story to another like that. That's going to happen more and more. And I think if you're ready for it, or at least you've got some ideas in mind of what you might do with it, or you might decide that you don't want that. I think I wish that I had known when I was younger how stressful journalism would be. I didn't know that when I was younger, and it's just something that accumulated over the years, and I picked up, and then it was like, this is stressful work, and a lot of times it's not because you're in scene, but I talk with Marie, the woman in Unbelievable, regularly, and and I interviewed her at length about what she had gone through. That doesn't mean that I am going through the trauma that she went through to anywhere even remotely near the degree that she did. But you're observing little bits of other people's experiences as you go along. And when you're consistently writing stories about horrific things, you are absorbing little bits of that. And as they build up, a lot of times you don't recognize it until you're just really depressed and in need of some help. But what I do find comforting is that even reporters of my generation, it's much more common now to talk about it. Yeah. And that's really a good thing.
Good. Renata asks, is there any story that you wrote that you wish you had done differently? Maybe the way you reported or tackled the story or interviewed?
Probably. Yeah, there is. And the evidence of it is in my garage, where I have 6 banker's boxes of a story that I wrote 19 years ago that I wish had been done differently. And the reason I carry those banker's boxes around is because I want to take another crack at it. And I'd either like to write it as a book or write it as a movie. And I've been in contact with some people about those possibilities. It was a story about an attorney in Chicago who handled death penalty cases. And he was an attorney I knew, not well, but I knew him. And he had been an alcoholic, a blackout alcoholic for much of his life. He became sober when he was in his early 40s. And after he quit drinking, he did incredible work in the last 12 years or so of his life. He helped free a number of innocent men from death row, and he was a huge participant in what happened in Illinois when they declared a moratorium on executions, and then years later, abolished the death penalty. At the time that he was dealing with his own drinking, and then with the work that he was doing, he had a son who was mentally ill, and his mental health was deteriorating. And ultimately, when his name was Dick Cunningham, when Dick reached the pinnacle of success professionally as an attorney, and he was being honored and recognized for all of the work that he had done, his son's mental illness reached the point where his son stabbed Dick to death. He stabbed him to death in Chicago at his home. And I wrote a series for the Chicago Tribune about it, but the series was published after I had left the paper. I went and was doing a visiting professorship at Princeton, and I didn't have control over the story. So it was being published and edited after I was gone. And this will sound like I'm whining. It's not that, but I just wasn't, I wasn't happy with the way it turned out. And I always felt like there was so much in Dick's life and in his work and in his family that, still has resonance today, that I'd like to do that story over again. I think a lot of reporters had that sense. A lot of times for them, it's a story that never got published, and they carry those folders and files around with them for years. That's the one for me.
Yeah.
I would really, really like to have a second try at that story. I think it would make an outstanding movie, frankly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Gaye asks, and I hear this from a lot of this concern from a lot of student journalists. If you're reporting a story and there's an emergency, when to intervene? Why? The question about stepping out of your journalistic role and helping somebody who's obviously in immediate danger or emergency. How do you think about that kind of scenario?
I haven't been in that situation often, if ever, or ever, that I can think of. So I'm not speaking from personal experience here, but the way I've thought about it in anticipation of it happening is that you're a person first and a journalist second. And I think if somebody is in danger, if you're a person first, you help them. But the scenarios, the hypotheticals here are endless, right?
Yeah.
Some of them I think would be very easy, right? You see somebody who is drowning and you have a life ring, something that you can throw to them that they can grab onto. Of course, you throw it to them, right? That shouldn't even be debatable, I don't think. But I can start, changing that scenario in ways where it becomes more complicated. And but in general, I think that when I do my work, one of my guiding principles is I want to be able to sleep well at night. And because of that, I don't want to lie to people in the reporting I'm doing. I don't want to mislead them. I don't want them to think that I sandbagged them, that they thought they were going to go in an interview for one reason and it turned out to be another. I want to be able to feel good about the work that I do when I go to bed at night. And I think that question would tie into that as well.
Sure.
If you didn't help somebody and you were in a place where you could have, and you didn't because you thought it would somehow compromise your journalistic principles, I think you might have trouble sleeping at night.
Or you ought to. Yeah, good. Next one from another of my students. What kind of ethical dilemmas have you run into as a journalist? Can you recall a specific ethical dilemma that you've had to deal with? My students know that I have plenty of examples where I felt I could look back and say, yeah, I think I handled that well, or oh my gosh, I totally mishandled that. I should have been thinking this, or whatever. Do you have a situation with that too?
I don't have any that come immediately to mind in terms of straight up right or wrong. Instead, the issues that I more normally confront are when I'm writing a story, you come to a fork in the road and you're worried that one way will cause harm and the other way won't. And I guess that is an ethical dilemma in a way. And I'll give you, one of the examples that we wrestled with Unbelievable, an unbelievable story of rape. What we wrestled with in that story was the two writers were men, the two lead editors were men, and we were writing about a crime that disproportionately harms women. And we were all worried that we would have blind spots that we were not aware of. We were all worried that we would make assumptions that if one of us were not a man, we wouldn't be making. And we were really concerned in writing that story about finding the middle ground between sanitizing what people were going through and how they had been hurt and sensationalizing it. Sexual assault is such a difficult subject to write about because if you fall on either side of that, if you're sensationalizing or you're sanitizing, you're doing a disservice. But it's hard to find that middle ground. And when we were writing the story that appeared online, I wrote 2 different final chapters, and they were all about that decision about which direction you go in. And if any of you have read the story, what it does, it ends at the beginning. The final chapter before you get to the epilogue is about what really happened in Marie's apartment the day when she reported being assaulted. In one of the endings that I wrote, it ends with the attacker in the doorway of her bedroom and just stops, doesn't say what happens afterwards, because the thinking being that it's implied or we know. The other one, without being gratuitous, described what actually happened when she woke up and saw Mark O'Leary in her doorway and what he did to her afterwards. I wasn't sure which was the better ending, which is why I wrote 2. And what we did is we had so many women read both of the endings. And fortunately, the managing editor at both newsrooms, the managing editor at the Marshall Project was Kirsten Danis, and the managing editor at ProPublica was Robin Fields. Our copy editor on the story was a woman. We had cold readers come in. We farmed them out to different people asking for their input. And it was unanimous, except for one person who could have gone anyway. But the women readers were adamant that we needed the ending that described what happened in the bedroom. They said it would be an absolute disservice to Marie to not tell readers what actually happened to her, about what she had suffered, about what she told police, and how she wasn't believed. The copy editor on the story wrote a long, impassioned memo about this and saying, you have to do this. And then I asked Marie. I talked to Marie about this story as well. And we also used some audio, the only audio in the entire story at the very end of it, in which Marie, in a 1-minute audio excerpt, describes the assault. And before we played that, included it, I made sure that she knew about it, that she listened to it, and that she was okay with it. Because we were debating, do we or don't we? And there was a strong divide among people about do we or don't we? And it was like, let's ask Marie. And she not only agreed that it could be used, and again, we didn't give her veto power. We were asking for her input. She wanted us to play it. She was like, I want people to hear my voice. I want people to hear the story that wasn't believed. And I not only am amenable to you playing it, I want you to play it. And I think a lot of times that helps, is that we don't ask people. We're forever imagining what we think they would answer, because a lot of people thought Marie would be opposed to it. And I mean, I guess, again, I don't know if that's an ethical quandary, but it was a judgment call. And I think I might have made the wrong call if I had left it to myself. I think I might have gone with the other ending. But once we reached out and got feedback from so many other people, it became abundantly clear to all of us that the ending we wound up using was the right one.
Wow. Yeah. Great story. Great story. Ken, you said you still keep in touch with Marie. How is she doing now?
She's doing okay. It's tough, you know. She's still a long haul truck driver, which is, you know, difficult, challenging work. Um, and she's doing okay. But you know, we were even talking before about therapy. One of the things that has always troubled me the most about what happened to Marie is that when she was charged criminally filing a false police report, she reached a deal with the court under which she got counseling for a year. But the counseling was for lying. It wasn't for being a victim of sexual assault. So
Agreed.
she's never received counseling for sexual assault. And I I I often wonder, you know,
Yeah.
how helpful that would be. And the kind of work she does right now, she's on the road so often that it would be difficult for her to do that. But that's something that the people at Netflix have been incredibly respectful and responsible for Marie, and have made all kinds of help available to her in a ways that a journalist might not be able to do. Right? I can't pay for counseling for
Mhm.
Marie, but the folks at Netflix can. Right? And that kind of goes back to the other question too about helping people. But I can listen to Marie, and when we talk, I mean, I'm still a journalist. She's still someone whose life I've written about, but I'm not interviewing her. I
Right.
haven't been interviewing her for years. You
Right.
know, we just talk and catch up. And and one of the things I'm always grateful about is that it you know, it took 7 months before Marie agreed to be interviewed for this story. But after she did, she's not regretted it. She's never called. That's one of those fears you have
Yeah.
as a reporter. Somebody's going to call you afterwards, write you a note saying, "Boy, I wish I had never done that. I didn't anticipate that this would happen or that would happen." She hasn't had that experience, and I'm thankful for that.
Yes. That's a real credit to you. Good. Ken, thank you so much. This has been terrific. Uh, just thank you for sharing so much pieces of wisdom and recounting some important stories. I think we've all learned quite a bit. Um, we're about out of time, but I do want to end by one more question, and maybe on a somewhat brighter note. Evan's question: what is the most rewarding or fulfilling aspect of your job, of your career?
It has been, one of the things has been growing within the field and never feeling satisfied with where I'm at in a particular moment. Journalism rewards adaptability, and it, you wouldn't know that necessarily from some newsrooms, but in general, the more you're able to learn and adapt, the better. The most rewarding aspect is that you really do. This will sound cliched, but you really do get to make a difference. And for me, the best night of my life as a journalist was when I was at the Chicago Tribune. We wrote a series about the failures of the death penalty in Illinois. And it was a 5-part series where we laid out all the various fault lines about why it was that innocent people were being convicted and condemned to death in Illinois. And after we published the story, the governor declared a moratorium on executions and said he wasn't going to sign any more death warrants because he was convinced that the system was broken. And when he made the announcement, he cited our work. He cited the statistics. You know, the Chicago Tribune found this, and this. That that was really rewarding.
Yeah.
I mean, because you really are making a life and death difference in people's lives. And 4 of the people we wrote about in the series, he pardoned based on innocence, so they were freed. We didn't break all of those stories. We broke background with several of them, but in others, it was a community effort where you had journalists in Chicago at the Chicago Reader, journalism students at Northwestern who were doing phenomenal work. It was kind of a journalism collective, I think, at that time, who were looking at wrongful convictions and everything was going wrong in Cook County and in Illinois. But you will have moments like that where your work has made a real difference in one person's life, or maybe in a community's future. And there aren't a lot of fields that offer that kind of reward. And you get to be creative in how you do it as well.
Yeah.
You know, and the creativity is incredibly rewarding.
Yeah. Terrific. Gosh, Ken, thank you so much. This has been a fabulous evening. And I wish we could have you here personally, but you know what? Maybe we can make that happen in the next year or two or three.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was actually so much fun. And
Oh.
even though I'm not able to get out of the house, at least I'm out of my head,
Well,
for an hour and a half, which is delightful.
Well, Ken, as always, it's just been great to talk to you, and thanks for sharing. And let's keep in touch. And
right.
Best of luck to you in your endeavors at ProPublica.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. And
All
thanks,
right.
everyone. Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.